Liberalism, the New Deal, Lecture 3. So in the previous lecture, I gave you the basic account of Roosevelt's vision of government as embodied in the Commonwealth Club Address. The idea that through the process of industrialization, America has developed to a point where it is threatened by oligarchy, where a very small number of people, because of their position in the economy, threaten to become, in effect, the ones who run the country. And during this period of economic growth, we finally reached a point, according to him, where the anarchy of market competition, unregulated by government, has led to economic disaster in the form of the Great Depression. And so from out of this crisis, Roosevelt hopes there will emerge, as he calls it, an economic constitutional order, a recognition that there needs to be a fundamental shift in America's constitution of government, our understanding of what government is there for. And in particular, he argues that we must recognize that the government has a task to more actively manage the economic life of the country, both in terms of regulating and guiding economic activity and in making sure that material resources are equitably redistributed. And as a moral foundation for this view of a regulatory and welfare state, he argues that Americans need to update their understanding of the social contract, and they need to update their understanding of individual rights. That we have to recognize that under modern conditions, everybody in society should have a right to work for a living wage, to be secure materially in their savings, so that during childhood, sickness, and old age, they are not threatened by poverty and deprivation. And from this, you get the basic kind of package of New Deal programs, including Social Security is probably the most famous one, retirement pensions for Americans. So in this last lecture on FDR, I'm going to sort of go through a couple other things from his speeches, from his first inaugural address in 1933, his renomination acceptance speech in 1936, and his State of the Union address in 1944. And the focus here will be primarily on the call for vigorous presidential leadership, the explanation of his understanding for why political liberties without economic security are not sufficient to guarantee freedom, and then his sort of laying out what he thinks the expanded understanding of basic rights that Americans have should be. So from the first inaugural, I'm really just going to bring out his understanding of the role of presidential leadership. And this starts on the bottom of page 197. I'm not going to read, the famous statement, all we have to fear is fear itself. Everybody's familiar with that one. But he argues near the bottom of page 197, he says, if I read the temper of our people correctly, we now realize, as we have never realized before, our interdependence on each other, that we cannot merely take, but we must give as well, that if we are to go forward, we must move as a trained and loyal army, willing to sacrifice for the good of the country, because without such discipline, no progress is made, no leadership becomes effective. We are, I know, ready and willing to submit our lives and property to such discipline because it makes possible a leadership which aims at a larger good. This I propose to offer. That is, this leadership I propose to offer. And he goes on to say at the top of page 198, with this pledge taken, this pledge to offer the kind of leadership that the disciplined army of the American people needs in order to overcome this period of hardship, it says, with this pledge taken, I assume unhesitatingly the leadership of this great army of our people, dedicated to a disciplined attack upon our common problems. Action, and so you have this kind of vision here. It's somewhat militaristic in character, right? In some ways, it almost sounds a little bit like the sort of the rhetoric of somebody like Mussolini, this idea of the people as an army, martial discipline as a model for citizenship, right? And he's kind of appealing to that notion of struggle and sacrifice for the greater common good, and he presents himself as the leader, the president as the leader. And again, somebody, a kind of strict constitutionalist might say, well, wait a second, where do you get the authority to be that kind of leader? That's not what the office of the president is. in the Constitution. So where are you getting this from? And here's what he has to say. It's where we left off. Action in this image and to this end is feasible under the form of government which we have inherited from our ancestors. So in other words, he says, in the first place, he denies that it's incompatible with the office of the president as laid out in the Constitution. He says, our Constitution is so simple and practical that it is possible always to meet extraordinary needs by changes in emphasis and arrangement without loss of essential form. That's kind of vague, but the idea is there's room to move within this office of the president. It says that is why our constitutional system has proved itself the most superbly enduring political mechanism the modern world has produced. It has met every stress of vast expansion of territory, of foreign wars, of bitter internal strife, of world relations. It is to be hoped that the normal balance of executive and legislative authority may be wholly adequate to meet the unprecedented task before us. So let's hope that the executive and the legislature can work together according to its normal ways to address this problem. But there's a but. He says, but it may be that an unprecedented demand and need for undelayed action may call for temporary departure from that normal balance of public procedure. Translation meaning the executive is going to have to take a more vigorous leadership role in guiding how things go if Congress won't do it. That's why he says, I am prepared under my constitutional duty to recommend measures that a stricken nation in the midst of a stricken world may require. But in the event that the Congress shall fail to take one of these courses, and in the event that the national emergency is still critical, I shall not evade the clear course of duty that will then confront me. I shall ask the Congress for the one remaining instrument to meet the crisis, broad executive power to wage war against the emergency as great as the power that would be given to me if we were in fact invaded by a foreign foe. So in other words, he's willing to ask for a large expansion of presidential power to meet this crisis. So there you can see how, he really presents himself as an energetic leader, willing to kind of stretch the boundaries of the traditionally understood office of president in the face of this emergency. Now, from there, we move on to the acceptance speech for renomination. This is on page 200. And I can't read through all of this, but in some ways, this is an even clearer speech than the Commonwealth Club address when it comes to his understanding of American political and economic development. But it's not entirely original. It's not really that different from Wilson, so I don't necessarily need to read that much about it. But the basic story he tells is that once upon a time, basically in 1776, our freedom was endangered by British tyranny. And so we waged a war of independence against that, and we established a constitutional order based on principles of individual rights and political liberty, and we won. Right? The battle for political liberty was fought and won in the 1700s, and we have inherited those institutions. Right? So this is kind of the version of how, remember, Woodrow Wilson had said, the actual problems laid out in the Declaration of Independence aren't our problems anymore. We have solved all those. We have political liberty. As he says, political tyranny was wiped out at Philadelphia on July 4th, 1776. That's page 200. But the story doesn't end there, right? Because as he says, since that struggle, however, man's inventive genius released new forces in our land which reordered the lives of our people. And he goes on to talk about industrialization, and through industrialization, the creation of this sort of corporate oligarchy, right, that he'd been warning about, and that Wilson had warned about. And in emphasizing the continuity with the struggle of the founding, he calls these people here not oligarchs, but economic royalists. So this kind of idea that these corporate titans seeking to run America, they're kind of like those old British aristocrats that we fought, except that their power isn't rooted in, aristocratic feudal political structures. They're royalists, but their power is rooted in their economic power, right? So it's not that they're actually, as a political class, given rights and powers that ordinary citizens don't have. No, we have that rule of law and equality of rights that was established at the time of the founding. But the problem is, outside of the political sphere, in the economic sphere, there is such massive inequality that even though these people don't, technically speaking, have extra political rights and powers, they nonetheless have so much wealth that they can run the government, or they have a disproportionate influence on the government. And in that sense, you have, again, a kind of loss of freedom, a new form of tyranny, right? And one of the main things in this speech that he emphasizes that it leads to is that they exploit their position of great wealth in order to structure the economic system in such a way that lots and lots of people have to work at, kind of dangerous and low-paying jobs, right? So in effect, arguing that the titans of industry are claiming more than their fair share of the national wealth at the expense of other workers. And for Roosevelt, what this means is that even though technically speaking, this means average Americans have not, and poor Americans have not been actually disenfranchised. They have not been denied the right to vote. Elections have not been suspended. There hasn't been a coup. There hasn't been a reestablishment of monarchy or aristocracy. As Woodrow Wilson emphasized, the structure and form of our electoral democracy is still there and still functioning. Right? So people have their civil rights. They've got elections. You've got Congress. Right? The House is still standing for election every 2 years. Part of the Senate every 2 years. The president every 4 years. The whole machinery of political liberty is still going on as it has been since the time of the founding. But that doesn't mean we're free, because political liberty isn't all there is to liberty. Freedom requires not just political rights, but also economic security. That's his argument. As he says, the second to last paragraph on page 201, an old English judge once said, "Necessitous men are not free men." Necessitous means not having the basic necessities of life. So desperately poor men are not free men. Liberty requires opportunity to make a living decent according to the standard of the time, a living which gives man not only enough to live by, but something to live for. And he says, and that's what's missing. So we have our political liberty, but we're not truly free because of economic deprivation, which robs our lives of true freedom. As he says, for too many of us, the political equality we once had won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality. A small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. Right? So economic insecurity and deprivation vitiates freedom. You're not really free unless you have both political rights and economic security. So if the source of this unfreedom and if the source of this inequality lies in the operations of the market, then if that's what you believe, then for somebody like Roosevelt, clearly the solution to this problem does not lie in the free market. So where can the American people look for an agent that can correct these economic inequities? And obviously, there is only one candidate in society that actually has the power to counteract these inequalities, to remedy these inequalities and injustices that are the result of the operations of the market. And that one place is government. Right? As he says on page 202, first full paragraph, against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could appeal only to the organized power of government. The collapse of 1929 showed up the despotism for what it was, right? The anarchy of the market leading to the crash and the ruin of so many people's lives. The election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it. And under that mandate, it is being ended. So in other words, the only place that the ordinary people can look to correct the injustices produced by the market is the government. That's the only other thing that's powerful enough. And so that's part of the role of government. Again, this is that idea of the general welfare view, that the role of government is to intervene in society in order to create more just, more equitable social conditions for all. And that's why you need regulation and redistribution. So the way that he formulates part of that really comes out in his State of the Union address from 1944, where he lays out his economic Bill of Rights. And so this is a little bit repetitive, but it's important to see it. And so what I'm going to do here, as I mentioned, is Roosevelt actually wanted these rights he was about to list really to be, added as amendments to the Constitution. But that never happened. Nonetheless, every single one of the rights that he names here does become the basis for one or more sort of social policies meant to provide those things. So I'll go through, and as I read it, I'll kind of give you examples of how the government actually does pursue these ends that he's laying out. So at the bottom of page 204, you have this is a kind of a recap. He says, this republic had its beginning and grew to its present strength under the protection of certain inalienable political rights, right? So rights of citizens and participation. Among them, the right of free speech, free press, free worship, trial by jury, freedom from unreasonable searches and seizures. They were our rights to life and liberty. So there he's referring to rights protected in the original Bill of Rights. Free speech, free press, free worship. Those are, that's all the First Amendment. Trial by jury, unreasonable searches and seizures. So those were our political rights. That was how we secured our liberty, from the beginning. It says, as our nation has grown in size and stature, however, as our industrial economy expanded, these political rights proved inadequate to assure us equality in the pursuit of happiness. Right, so even with these political rights, those political rights weren't enough to actually make it the case that every American had an equal shot at pursuing happiness. Right, as he says, top of page 205, we have come to a clear realization of the fact that true individual freedom cannot exist without economic security and independence. Necessitous men are not free men. People who are hungry and out of a job are the stuff of which dictatorships are made. So again, the individual freedom in the political sense is not enough. It has to be supported by economic independence and security. And so here he goes on to give his list of how he thinks that that economic security can be assured through governmental action. He says, in our day, these economic truths have become accepted as self-evident. We have accepted, so to speak, a second Bill of Rights under which a new basis of security and prosperity can be established for all, regardless of station, race, or creed. So a second Bill of Rights, certain new inalienable rights. And he says, among these are, and then he gives a list, and I'll just take you through them. He says, the right to a useful and remunerative job in the industries or shops or farms or mines of the nation. So in other words, the right to work, right? Not necessarily a government-provided job, but if necessary, a government-provided job. Now, obviously, the right to work or the right to a job is not something that has been formally legislated by Congress, but you do have both local, state, and the federal government in various ways through unemployment offices are involved in helping people to find jobs. And at times, the government during the New Deal and other times, the government has directly provided jobs as a form of what we would nowadays call economic stimulus. So the next one, the right to earn enough to provide adequate food and clothing and recreation. So in other words, that's the right to a living wage, the right to a wage by means of which you could support your family, have enough food, shelter, recreation, all that kind of stuff. Now, obviously, again, that hasn't directly been legislated, but we do have things like federal and state defined minimum wages. There are food stamps and other such things. There, the right to unionize in various circumstances was recognized so that people could collectively bargain for higher wages. So, the pursuit of something like a minimum or a living wage has been, legislated in various ways. The third one is basically talking about agricultural subsidies, and we don't need to get into that. Fourth one, the right of every businessman, large and small, to trade in an atmosphere of freedom from unfair competition and domination by monopolies at home or abroad. So this is what is usually referred to as antitrust legislation, this concern that when certain businesses become so large and control so much of the share of their market that in effect there's no effective competition, and therefore they have the freedom to kind of set prices wherever they want, and thereby exploit consumers and crowd out competition from other businesses. There's a recognition that the government has a role to play in breaking up monopolies, business monopolies, to make sure that there is adequate economic competition so that consumers have fair treatment, fair prices, and so that others who want to get into economic activity have at least some shot at competing. And the next right is the right of every family to a decent home. So the right to a house, the right to shelter. This, legislatively speaking, takes the form of the provision of public housing or housing subsidies to those who fall below a certain, poverty rate, and therefore are entitled to governmental assistance in finding and paying for housing. And also, public housing. The right to adequate medical care and the opportunity to achieve and enjoy good health. You guys are all familiar with that one because this debate's still going on, right? The role of government in providing medical care. Now, this, in terms of what comes out of the New Deal, there's actually nothing. This was an area where the New Deal did not actually get the government involved in healthcare. So this was sort of a wish list item. But Lyndon Johnson in the 1960s, this was one of the items on the New Deal agenda that he implemented, right? Because there's a way in which this second Bill of Rights provides a kind of template of objectives that the Democratic Party has been devoted to achieving since the 1930s. So some of these things, like Social Security, were achieved at the time of the New Deal. Some of them just remained as a kind of wish list. And one of those was medical care. So nowadays we do have, there's Medicaid, which provides health insurance or coverage for the poor, Medicare for the elderly. Obviously you've also have, what is it, the CHIP for children, and then there's the Affordable Care Act. And so this is something that's still hotly debated across parties and within each party. But, basically his argument here is that the right to health care and the right to health is something that should be recognized, and the government should have some kind of role in making sure that it's provided for. The next one is the right to adequate protection from the economic fears of old age, sickness, accident, and unemployment, right? And this is obviously things like Social Security, right? So a pension for people of retirement age, again, Medicare, Medicaid, disability payments, unemployment assistance, very relevant topic nowadays. This would also, involve things like stimulus payments, such as what we've had. So, the government's done a lot of things here. The next one is the right to a good education. That one hasn't necessarily been recognized, but you could say that the child of that was the development of federal student loan programs. So, the growth of public and at least nominally affordable universities. But beyond that, the provision of grants and loans to help people afford college who otherwise would not be able to afford it. And so as he says, all of these rights spell security. Security, that's the goal, material security. So he said some of these things were achieved by Roosevelt, some of these things were achieved subsequently, some of them have yet to be fully achieved and are still part of the liberal or progressive agenda. But really, FDR is laying out a lot of it there. Now, one of the things, just to wrap this up, one of the things you might notice then is that in some ways the New Deal is kind of materialistic. And by that I mean it is predominantly concerned with issues of the distribution of material wealth and economic opportunity. Now, it doesn't mean that that's all that Roosevelt had on his mind. There was kind of a cultural component too, but it doesn't really come out until later. And so what we'll see in the next series of lectures when we get to Lyndon Johnson and the Great Society is that in the 1960s, under the leadership of Lyndon Johnson, the Democratic Party kind of does a few things. On the one hand, it kind of picks up where Roosevelt left off and continues to implement elements of the New Deal agenda, such as things like more public housing and the war on poverty, food stamps, Medicare, Medicaid, things like that. So part of what Lyndon Johnson will do is just to continue the New Deal agenda, but other items will be added to the sort of the liberal progressive political agenda. One of which is the fight against discrimination in various forms based on race, sex, sexual orientation, things like that. So that the federal government will become more actively involved in trying to root out discrimination in society, and also a broader concern for provision of governmental sort of services or support for things that add to quality of life that aren't about the material distribution of things. You think about stuff like PBS and NPRs, like public broadcasting, public television, the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for the Humanities. There are a bunch of programs that come out of the Great Society whose aim was really more to kind of enrich American cultural life in a non-commercial way. And so all of these things, both the material concerns of the New Deal, the concerns with discrimination, the concerns with kind of broader quality of life and how to achieve it, all of these fit within, Woodrow Wilson's sort of way of talking about the need for the government to intervene in society to restructure social relations and restructure social institutions in a way that improve the quality of life and enhance the opportunities of ordinary people. Right? So part of that is intervention in the economy, but it can also involve things like intervention in discriminatory practices. And it can take the form of actually promoting the arts, promoting culture, promoting media, and things like that. So all of these kind of things kind of still fit within what Merriam would have called the general welfare view, where you go beyond merely preventing people from harming one another and move into a positive vision of government as securing certain important conditions of life and promoting certain important objectives for a kind of broader understanding of the common good. So that's what we'll get to next time when we get to the Great Society programs of the 1960s.